Hi, I'm Werner from the Radkoczy Tales channel, where we dive deep into the Warhammer Fantasy lore. To begin, I'd like to share a little secret with you. Long time ago, back when alcohol and I were still on good terms, I used to play Warhammer Fantasy battles. Wood Elves no less. Those were the days of 4th edition battle. Not exactly cheerful times, mind you, far from it, but they were not yet quite as grim as the editions that followed. One of the most significant changes introduced in those later years was the emergence of the forest itself as a distinct force, one with which the Asrai entered into a fragile yet surprisingly enduring alliance. Today we'll take a closer look at how that forest functions and explore the many spirits of nature that inhabit Athel Loren and beyond. Before we begin, however, an important note. Athel Loren is the greatest magical forest in the old world, but it is by no means the only one. Laurelorn, Avelorn, and even the Dark Forest at the foot of the World's Edge Mountains are just a few examples of places where wilderness and magic intertwine. The creatures that dwell within one enchanted forest may also be found in others. Sometimes they are even the very same beings, for the wild places of the Warhammer world are connected to one another to a certain extent. Some may be reached through the roots of the Oak of Ages, while others can be accessed by passing through the half-demonic realm of Tlakaelel, the Dreaming Good. That was only a single paragraph, yet it introduced quite a few names and concepts that deserve some explanation before we move on to the individual nature spirits that inhabit the deepest forests. Let us begin with the main subject of today's episode, Athel Loren itself. Or more broadly, the magical forest. For once, it was far larger and far more magical than it is today. The forest is a relic from the age beyond the collapse of the polar gates, and its oldest trees are said to have been planted by the Old Ones themselves, likely intended to serve some purpose within the Great Plan. What purpose? That, unfortunately, is something we shall never know. Yet even before chaos came into the world, the forest had already begun to develop a measure of self-awareness and to experience emotions. Mostly unpleasant ones, particularly when it came to realize that many of the strange, wandering creatures sheltering beneath its branches regarded it not merely as a home, but as a food or, worse still, as a source of raw materials. Even then, in certain places saturated with magical energy, all manner of nature spirits began to manifest. Over time, these spirits developed personalities of their own. For all of them, however, the forest remained of paramount importance. Its safety and continued existence were their highest purpose. Most of these spirits remained where they first awakened, tending to and protecting the place they called home. Some, however, ventured out into the wider world, helping other forests awaken and spreading the forest's domain even further. In this way, one of the oldest spirits of the forest, known among the elves as Durthu, eventually found his way to Ulthuan, specifically to the kingdom of Avelorn, then ruled by the first ever queen, whose name has been preserved in history. His deeds there are a subject worthy of an episode of their own. For us, however, the more important question is how a forest spirit managed to cross an ocean and reach the magical island continent in the first place. The answer lies in the roots of the Oak of Ages mentioned earlier, the immense magical tree that grows at the heart of Athel Loren. It is the greatest of the trees planted by the Old Ones and serves as both the heart and, in a sense, a circulatory system of the forest itself. To grasp its scale, consider that ordinary trees appear as saplings beside it, while even the largest redwoods would reassemble little more than shrubs. For many Asrai mages, acorns from this tree serve as powerful talismans and reservoirs of magical energy, while its crown would likely be visible from space. Most importantly, for our purpose today, its vast roots, which also function as natural channels through which magical energy flows, reach across a considerable portion of the Warhammer world. Through them, both nature spirits and those Asrai who have learned the secrets of the roots can travel vast distances. How exactly does this work? Here we arrive at another important aspect of Athel Loren and its nature spirits. This particular part of Warhammer lore is remarkably soft. By that, I mean it follows what fantasy fans would call a soft magic system, where the workings of magic are not rigidly defined and many details are left to the imagination. Such is the case with the Oak of Ages, whose deepest secrets may be known only to Ariel herself, the earthly incantation of the goddess Isha, who spends the winter months within the tree's interior. The same is true of the nature spirits. Their powers are never described in precise detail, and they seem to exist along a spectrum of strength. The older they are, the more powerful they become, yet the boundaries between the various types of spirits remain somewhat fluid and ill-defined. Having dealt with the roots of the Oak of Ages, it's time to return our attention to Tlakaelel, a mysterious realm which, despite sharing part of its name with one of the elven forests, has only a passing connection to forests as we normally understand them. The Dreaming Wood does not exist entirely within the material world. One may enter it only from wild places where significant concentrations of magical energy have gathered. Its true nature is no less ambiguous, for Tlakaelel is a place in between, a dangerous, treacherous, and at times deadly place, which nature spirits nonetheless sometimes use for travel. It lies somewhere between the magical forests, the mortal world, and the realm of chaos itself. More specifically, it seems to brush against the domain of Slaanesh, whose servants display a peculiar tendency to wander the Dreaming Wood in search of lost elves and other souls upon which they might feed. Reading the sparse lore available on Tlakaelel, I cannot help but think of a twisted forest that, according to the tales of madmen and visionaries, surrounds a certain fortress within Slaanesh's realm. We are unlikely ever to learn how closely these two places are connected, whether they are truly linked, merely neighboring regions somewhere beyond reality, or whether all of this is nothing more than my own speculation. What we can say for sure is that the descriptions are strikingly similar, and among mortals, only the most experienced war dancers know how to navigate the path of the Dreaming Wood with any degree of safety, which, thematically at least, only reinforces my suspicion that we are dealing with related phenomena. I mean, who else but low-ex war dancers would willingly wander into places like that to fight the servants of Slaanesh? In any case, the Dreaming Wood also points us toward another trait shared by all nature spirits. In some ways, they are a bit like demons. Not because they originate from the realm of chaos, nothing of the sort, but because, at their core, they are immaterial beings, even though they can assume physical forms when they choose so. They are only able to manifest, however, in places permanently saturated with magical energy. There must be at least some similarity in their nature, because on several occasions demons, particularly those of Nurgle, have successfully masqueraded as forest spirits, deceiving and misleading elven mages in the process. Nature spirits are also capable of inhabiting and animating physical matter, such as dead leaves, fallen branches, or even entire trunks of dead trees, allowing them to exert influence upon the physical world. Most often, they do so when the forest is threatened. When no immediate danger looms, however, they frequently prefer subtler methods. They mislead, entice, and enchant the thinking creatures they encounter in pursuit of their own goals. Goals that are often difficult, if not impossible, for mortals to fully understand. It is probably these differing ambitions, along with the distinct personalities they have developed over time, that led mages throughout the Old World and beyond to distinguish nature spirits from elementals and other ethereal manifestations. It is said that every rock, every stream, and every tree either is, or once was, home to some manner of spirit. Such beings can awaken only under the proper conditions, and certain druids, witches, and elven mages are said to possess the ability to communicate with them. Unlike demons, however, which likewise require areas saturated with magical energy in order to manifest, nature spirits can be truly destroyed rather than merely banished back into the ether. That is likely why they defend their beloved glades, groves, pools, and streams with such ferocity. We have already pointed out a number of similarities between nature spirits and some of the other supernatural entities that manifest within the Warhammer world. It is now worth highlighting the traits that set them apart. First and foremost, nature spirits are influenced, to some degree, by the changing seasons. They tend to be far more active in the height of summer, while winter is generally a time of rest and dormancy. Another thing that stands out to me is that chaos is usually incapable of corrupting nature spirits in the way one might expect. During the first chaos incursion, the spirits of the forest fought fiercely to defend their homes and paid a terrible price for doing so. The cost was measured not only in acres of burnt and devastated woodland, but also in the lasting effects of prolonged exposure to demons and the corruption that spread through nature in the wake. Many spirits became far wilder, more aggressive, and at times even cruel. It took a very long time for old wounds to heal, for the forest to recover, and for the spirits themselves to find peace once more. This theme of nature spirits descending into aggression and madness after prolonged exposure to chaos or dark magic appears repeatedly throughout the lore. Sometimes it occurs on a vast scale, affecting all of Athel Loren for extended periods, as happened following the poisoning of Ariel, the earthly incarnation of the goddess Isha and co-ruler of the magical forest. At other times, the scale is far smaller, as in the adventure Forest of Hate. Usually, once the source of the corruption is removed, the spirits gradually recover and return to their former state. But not always. The darkest region of Athel Loren has been surrendered to the most savage, malicious and warlike spirits of the forest, isolated from the rest of the woodland by a powerful magical barrier. It serves, in effect, as a prison for Dryads, naiads, treemen, and other spirits that would gladly exterminate every mortal they encounter, wood elves included. And so we have reached the point where it would be useful to say something about the various types of nature spirits themselves. First of all, this will not be a comprehensive catalogue of every nature spirit that exists. Instead, we will focus on those most commonly encountered in the old world and those that can be grouped into some kind of shared framework. Even so, it is important to remember that the boundaries between these spirits are far from rigid, and it is often difficult to identify the precise moment when, for example, a particularly powerful dryad inevitably becomes a young treeman. Let us begin with perhaps the most widespread of all nature spirits, the spites. Spites most commonly appear as tiny lights or flickering wisps, and ordinary folk tend to associate them with will-o'-the-wisp, fairy lights, sprites, or the countless other small supernatural beings found throughout real-world folklore. The spirits themselves do little to make classification easier. While they often appear as lights, they are equally capable of assuming more tangible forms. For example, tiny elf-like figures riding beetles, strange little birds with unusual features, animated leaves arranging themselves into faces upon tree trunks. Really, they can be almost anything. The only consistent rule seems to be that the physical form they adopt cannot be particularly large. The common folk who live on the fringes of the great forests of the Empire and beyond tend to treat spites with a healthy degree of caution. If local tradition dictates that one should leave a bowl of milk on a doorstep for them or avoid entering certain grooves, then that is exactly what one does. Spites are notoriously capricious, and it is generally unwise to provoke them. When offended, they can become remarkably malicious. Sometimes, for reasons known only to themselves, they take an interest in a particular individual, especially someone possessing magical talent. Such attention can be either a blessing or a source of endless trouble. When treated kindly, spites can be friendly enough, but their way of thinking is utterly alien to mortal minds, making it all too easy to offend them without even intending to do so. Generally speaking, only the forest-dwelling elves, the Asrai and the Eonir, as well as certain collegiate wizards, can realistically hope to understand the intentions of spites, or even form something resembling an alliance with them. Yet, even then, there are countless stories of these fickle spirits abandoning their companions at what appears to be a completely random moment, for a reason known only to themselves. It is said that every glade, pond, hill and stream once had its own guardian spirit. Today, despite remaining the most widespread of all nature spirits, spirits are seen far less frequently, flickering between the trees. Most are now found in places where magical energy naturally gathers, or in the company of greater nature spirits such as Dryads and treemen. The magic of the forest is slowly waning, however, and as a result, these capricious spirits increasingly find themselves competing over the dwindling sources of magical energy still available to them. Such rivalries often escalate into small but surprisingly vicious conflicts into which unfortunate mortals may find themselves drawn, usually against their will. There are countless varieties of spirits, just as there are countless ways in which they make their presence known. Some delight in leading travelers astray, others prefer frightening mortals. Still others amuse themselves by tangling equipment with tiny enchanted vines, increasing or suppressing a victim's desires, or tormenting them with countless tiny cuts far more irritating than mosquito bites. A few are even said to possess some limited ability to glimpse the future. Their forms and behaviors are so varied that any meaningful classification has proven nearly impossible. If destroyed, their bodies quickly disintegrate, making close study difficult except in those rare cases where one can be captured alive, which, as one might imagine, is something they dislike very, very much. Small spirits, small problems. Larger spirits, considerably larger problems, especially when someone stands in the way of their intentions. Naiads, Dryads and nymphs, for example, are vastly more powerful beings. And while they may appear very different at first glance, they share many common traits. This is by no means a complete catalogue of the greater nature spirits, of course. Older and more powerful spirits can manifest in countless forms, from unicorns and great stags to enormous toads and bizarre humanoid figures. One could even argue that Ifrits are a similar phenomenon, merely reflecting the spirit of the desert rather than the forest. Still, it is the Dryads and Naiads about whom we know the most. Let us begin with the Naiads, if only because they remain the more mysterious of the two. Presumably, this is because they never appeared as a dedicated Wood Elf unit in Warhammer Fantasy Battle. As one might expect, Naiads are spirits associated with water. Outside Athel Loren, where they are relatively common, particularly along the upper reaches of the river Grismery, they are a rare sight indeed. Yet they are not entirely unknown and may occasionally be encountered in especially wide stretches of river. They also feature prominently in folklore, where they often appear as beautiful yet unpredictable maidens who lure mortals to their watery doom, which is not entirely inaccurate. Like other nature spirits, Naiads are capable of altering their physical form. When they choose to reassemble humans, they most often appear as strikingly beautiful women. In truth, however, they can assume almost any shape they desire. The only consistent feature is some association with water. Perpetually damp hair, pale blue skin, garments woven from fishing nets, and similar motifs. Yet no one should be deceived by their beauty. Naiads and nymphs, which appear to be little more than another name for the same category of spirit, can become terrifyingly destructive when either they themselves or their beloved rivers and lakes are threatened. In such moments, they may assume a wrathful aquatic aspect, striking their enemies with the force of a waterfall. But the powers of water spirits extend far beyond simple violence. They are also capable of laying potent curses. One tale, for example, speaks of a victim doomed never again to have their thirst quenched by the waters of a particular river. Folklore surrounding Naiads also frequently suggests that time passes differently in their presence, flowing at a different pace for mortals than it does for the spirits themselves. Naiads rarely stray from their aquatic domains, Yet while researching this episode, I came across references suggesting that they are capable of consuming a mortal soul and replacing it with a fragment of their own essence. The victim survives, in a sense, but becomes little more than a living vessel, a puppet bound entirely to the will of the naiad. Perhaps the most famous naiad in the Empire, and certainly in Reikland, is the naiad of the Reik, known as Lorelei, whose beauty was immortalized by the poet Franz Heinrich Holzer. There are, however, alternative versions of the tale claiming that the muse who swam in those waters was not a naiad at all, but rather a half-naked elven maiden. In reference to the story, a rock formation along the Reik, some 40 miles from Grisenwald, also bears the name Lorelei. The entire tale is, of course, a nod to the famous rock of the very similar name that rises above the Rhine in our own world. Capitalizing on the famous Holzer poem brought to the region, local innkeepers have developed something of a specialty in housing bachelor parties. And although a bridge could theoretically be built near the rock, nobody in their right mind seriously considers the idea. Other rivers known to be inhabited by water spirits include the rivers Demst and the Blood, though this is certainly not a definitive list. Dryads are very similar to naiads in the sense that they too manifest in places saturated with magical energy. One might assume that Giran, the wind of life, would be the magical wind most closely associated with them. Yet we know from various sources that Dryads can also gather around places touched by other winds. Even Akshi, the wind of fire, seemingly so hostile to forests, can sustain their presence. In such cases, however, Akshi's volatile nature tends to amplify the capricious and passionate temperament of the spirits themselves. Dryads also resemble naiads in their ability to assume alluring forms. When they do so, they typically appear as beautiful women, marked by subtle woodland features. Olive or green-tainted skin, leaves woven through their hair, and similar traits. In such guises, they often wander enchanted glades and magical forests, luring their future victims even deeper into the woods. Dryads have changed considerably over the course of Warhammer's various editions. In 4th edition battle, they were relatively benevolent things who willingly aided the elves. Over time, however, they evolved into far wilder creatures who, at best, merely tolerate elven presence and fight alongside them only because they happen to share common enemies. And even that is not always the case. Many of the oldest and most powerful Dryads openly despise elves, while some, Dryads being the most obvious example, actively wage war against them. If you were wondering what sorts of spirits inhabit that prison-like region of Athel Loren I mentioned earlier, well, now you have your answer. In ages past, Dryads spent much of their time awakening new regions of forests. These days they are more commonly found gathering around even greater spirits, such as treemen, attending to their needs and serving them in various ways. They also hunt those who venture too deeply into the woods. Woodcutters, soldiers, wandering travelers, or simply the unfortunate lost souls. To a Dryad, the distinction hardly matters. The life force of the victim helps sustain both the spirit itself and the magical forest to which it is bound. Some individuals have even exploited this fact, offering bloody sacrifices to such spirits in hopes of winning their favor. When approaching an ordinary victim, a Dryad often first appears in one of her seductive forms, captivating the target with beauty, song, or simple fascination. Once the mortal falls under her spell, the attack comes swiftly. Hands become claws as hard as ancient branches, and the victim is torn apart before they fully understand the danger they are facing. The true warform of a Dryad, the one familiar from the tabletop game, resembles a living tree, though never quite the same tree twice. One moment its bark may be as hard as oak, the next its body may bend and sway like a birch in the wind, and moments later it may lash out with willow-like tendrils that coil around and entangle its enemies. Presumably, Dryads can imitate many other species of trees as well, but those three aspects were the ones that ultimately found their way into the battle game. Some Dryads, particularly the more powerful ones, are capable of weaving elaborate illusions or conjuring visions that reflect the deepest fears of their victims. They are also said to possess the ability to lay a wide variety of curses upon mortals. One such curse caused any timber taken from the Dryads' native forest to crumble into rotten dust the moment the victim touches it. That may not sound particularly frightening at first, but in the world where wood is used to build anything from homes to ships, such a curse can easily become a death sentence. Like most other forest spirits, Dryads are certainly found in both Athel Loren and Tlakaelel. These are hardly the only places where people tell stories of tree-like spirits, however. Along the fringes of the Dragvald, for example, villagers speak of trees that come to life and venture out at night in search of human blood. Similar tales are told by those living near the forests of Arden in Bretonia, where local folk avoid offending the spirits by gathering only branches that have already fallen naturally from the trees. One can safely assume that similar stories are widespread around the edges of many other ancient forests still connected to Athel Loren through the roots of the Oak of Ages, such as the forest of Susurio in Tailia. The next type of forest spirit is the being known as the Treekin. Although in their case it is rather difficult to say where the nature spirit ends, and, well, once again we find ourselves dealing with Warhammer's wonderfully soft magic system. The explanation encountered most often is that Treekin are, in essence, dead branches and fallen trunks animated by the soul of a deceased wood elf. Not every soul meets such a fate, however. The overwhelming majority, after the proper funeral rites have been performed, become one with the forest, dissolving into the living network known to the elves as the Weave. Only the most determined, tormented, or unwilling souls prove unable to let go of their former lives, eventually becoming Treekin instead. But that should not be mistaken for a form of immortality. No. Upon death, they lose most of their memories, retaining only shattered fragments of their former personalities. In many ways, they are no longer even half the people they once were. Treekin almost never speak, and when they do, their words come slowly, as though each thought were echoing from some impossibly distant and unfamiliar place. Which, in fairness, is hardly surprising. They experience reality in an entirely different way, and for most of them, the old world has become a strange place they scarcely understand. What remains are only fragments of powerful emotions that bind them to particular places or individuals they feel compelled to protect. Only exceptionally gifted spellcasters, Queen Marisif of Tlakaelel being one example, can communicate with Treekin well enough to persuade them to serve as personal guardians. For reasons that remain unclear, Treekin also seem drawn to Orion whenever he rides forth on the wild hunt. Most of the time, however, they simply stand watch over whatever place they have sworn to defend, remaining perfectly motionless for weeks at a time. Towering well over 2 meters tall, they vaguely reassemble elven figures fashioned from trunks, branches, and twisted limbs, often accompanied by swarms of spikes. As I mentioned earlier, the most common explanation is that Treekin are dead trees animated by the broken souls of fallen wood elves. Yet this is not the only origin story found in the lore. Much more rarely, sources describe them as nature spirits that temporarily inhabit dead trees and fallen timber whenever the need arises. When not possessing a wooden body, these spirits supposedly appear as small spheres of light, making them almost indistinguishable from some of the lesser forest spirits, such as sprites. Where Treekin animate dead trees, treemen are something else entirely. They are created when a mighty forest spirit permanently binds itself to a living tree, which from that moment onward is gradually reshaped according to the spirit's will. Such a union is never entered into lightly, for it can be broken only by the death of the tree itself. Treemen therefore exist much closer to the physical world than most nature spirits, using their massive trunks, thick bark and gnarled branches to reach places where an incorporeal spirit alone never could. Treemen are respected by both the elves and the other creatures and spirits of the forest. Many lesser spirits, spies for example, even make their homes within the hollows of their immense trunks. Unlike Dryads, Treemen generally show respect for all living things. Perhaps that is simply a consequence of their extraordinary age. Having witnessed countless centuries, they have gained the wisdom to understand that the forest needs way more than fearless defenders if it is to survive. It was the eldest treeman who once spoke on behalf of Athel Loren, forging the ancient alliance with those elves who chose to remain in the Elfin Arvan thousands of years ago. Treemen rarely leave the forest. More often than not, they spend years in a state reassembling deep slumber, particularly the oldest and most powerful among them. But when they do awaken and march to war, they become terrifying opponents. Towering like a greatest of giants, or more accurately, like ancient trees come to life, they can shatter an entire regiment with a single sweep of a massive branch or ensnare their enemies in grasping roots. The oldest treemen are also accomplished practitioners of the lore of life, wielding its spells with a mastery refined over thousands of years. Even so, the sight of a treeman upon the battlefield is exceptionally rare, and most humans regard them as a little more than figures from myths and fairy tales. Outside Athel Loren itself, the only place in the old world where treemen are known to dwell is the forest of Tlakaelel. That concludes our overview of the nature spirits most commonly encountered in the old world. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is by no means a complete catalogue. There are countless other kinds of nature spirits. These are simply the ones we know the most about. Yet, even in their case, much remains mysterious, and their way of thinking can be so utterly alien to mortal minds that they make a fascinating addition to almost any Warhammer campaign. Not necessarily as enemies, but as living personifications of nature itself. The lesser spirits in particular, sprites, dryads and naiads, are common enough to introduce into almost any adventure. Along with them comes no shortage of chaos, because their powers have never been fully defined, and the ways in which they interact with the world are often surprising enough to catch even veteran players off guard. Do you want some examples? Alright, here we go. Villagers who periodically abduct travelers to offer them as sacrifices to the Lady of the Forest. That's a refreshing change from yet another chaos cult. A naiad who has wrapped the local miller around her finger and convinced him to destroy the village watermill? Why not? Or perhaps a mysterious youth from the forest has been charming every young woman in the area. After all, no one ever said dryads always have to appear as women. There are just a few examples of nature spirits whose goals are, at least from a human perspective, somewhat understandable. But things can just as easily be very different. Perhaps someone offended a spirit without even realizing it. Perhaps the forest, the river, or a quiet woodland clearing stands in the way of progress, and the local lord has no idea that the moment the first axes bite into the trees, the ground will run red with blood. Or perhaps a once peaceful grove has suddenly become deadly because a source of dar has appeared deep within it, driving the forest spirits into madness. Or perhaps the threat isn't deadly at all. Maybe a sprite has placed an especially inventive and malicious curse upon someone. Perhaps only a forest spirit knows the answer to the mystery troubling the party. Maybe a mischievous will-o'-the-wisp decides to latch onto one of the characters and torment them simply out of spite. Or perhaps the players find themselves caught in the middle of the feud between rival sprites and have to resolve it somehow. There are countless ways to introduce nature spirits into your campaigns, and the fact that they have never been fully defined in the lore only makes the task easier. Let me know what you think about nature spirits in Warhammer and whether you've used them in your own adventures. If you like this material, I encourage you to subscribe to the Ratcatcher Tales channel if you haven't done so yet, or leave a like if you're already with us. That's all for today, take care, and I'll see you again very soon.